for having introduced me and made these introductory comments on the subject of India's foreign policy priorities in the shifting global landscape. You've also referred to in detail about the priority that you at the Heritage attached to Indo-US relationship. As you mentioned, I represent the Indian opposition. And even though in the domain of foreign policy, there has been a broader consensus on most issues as far as India is concerned, there are obviously deviations. But as a member of the opposition and a spokesman for the opposition in India, we do at times enjoy the liberty more than those in government have, in some of the nuances being a little different. Though I must, while mentioning this, still point out that on most broad issues, India has had a tradition of a larger, broader consensus within its domestic polity as far as foreign policy issues are concerned. First, a word about the domestic situation in India. You see, we've completed now almost, we are in the 64th year after our independence, and we are the world's largest democracy. And here in the United States, we interact with the world's most powerful democracy. And while we do that, our relationship is governed by several principles. But one of our own domestic concerns always has been that while we are making India into one of the faster growing economies the world over, we still have a great challenge domestically as far as poverty alleviation in India is concerned. A very large size of our population still has not benefited from the entire growth process in India, and there appears to be a broad convergence in our domestic priority as to how fast we can make sure that the benefits reach this larger group. And therefore, as far as our priorities have been, and that is one factor which governs some of our foreign policy priorities also, particularly because our domestic situation requires a very large part of our resource mobilization to be spent within the country. We are a country which is faced with serious defense and internal security issues. Jammu and Kashmir has been an issue on which there has been a top national priority. A lot of our expenditure goes into that. We've had areas of insurgency in northeastern parts of the country. We have current challenges in the central belt of India, particularly the tribal areas from ultra-left movements. We've gone through almost 3.5 wars with Pakistan. We've had a full-fledged battle with China in the 1962. And we live even today, despite the various developmental indexes in India, with somewhat a disturbed neighborhood. And therefore, it is under these areas that India, in these circumstances, frames its foreign policy's priorities in the current global situation. Now, the factors which have influenced us all these years predominantly include national security, our developmental priorities, and obviously our recognition of this world and the globe as interdependent, which needs peace and which needs initiatives from large states like India for its direction to move in a more developed and a more peaceful environment. While doing so, our priorities are governed and guided by our desires and our commitments which are against various forms of international terrorism, issues of the current moment which come up with extreme importance, climate change keeping our developmental priorities in mind, energy securities, the issue of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction which you just now mentioned. Now, it is these factors which have broadly governed in the last 6 decades India's foreign policy priorities. And obviously one of the most important factors has been our desire to ensure a very stable and peaceful environment in the region around us. Now, as a part of this, There are smaller states around us with which India has constantly attempted to have a very stable and cordial relationships. There have been issues which have come up, but we've matured in our relationship in dealing with those issues. As a result of which states like Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, even with their own domestic issues, have become states which are virtually getting integrated with the Indian economy and largely dependent even for their own growth processes in their interactions with us. We are certainly concerned with what's been happening in the last 2 decades in Afghanistan. And therefore, we find that the initiatives that the United States has taken over the last few years have been extremely welcome as far as we are concerned. We are committed to a historical relationship that India has had with Afghanistan within that region. One of our priorities, of course, has been to contribute to the developmental process after a near destruction in Afghanistan which has taken place. And we have been maintaining that traditional relationship with Afghanistan and are certainly concerned that as and when the United States does pull out, according to the timetable that it has in mind, it leaves behind a tradition where there is some stability and peace in the post-pull-out era which is secured in Afghanistan. But needless to say, the most important challenge for us within that region comes from the situation from our immediate neighbor in Pakistan. Now, Pakistan and India have had a relationship where we've undergone even military action on several occasions, the last one being a smaller version of a war which took place in 1999 during the Kargil infiltration which took place. Now, it almost sounds to us in India and also within my party as a very strange paradox that here was a country which was bifurcated into two. We were the same people who had a strong history of commonality with each other. And yet after 1947, we became very different. India developed a very strong tradition of democracy, pluralism within India. Pakistan, of course, embarked on a different course altogether. But recent instances have certainly caused a matter of concern for us. Now, we've had a situation, and I would not hesitate to say so, that Pakistan did not reconcile to the idea immediately after our partition in Kashmir and the state of Jammu and Kashmir being an integral part of India. And therefore, we had conventional wars in the first instance. We had 2 decades of insurgency coming from across the border. And then in the last 4 or 5 years, this has been substituted predominantly by some kind of violent movements instigated from across the border, which can take place within the valley itself. Now, despite this, and a broad Indian recognition that Pakistan over the last few years had become a global epicenter of global terrorism, and that it was using terrorism as an instrument of state policy, despite that and difficulties, governments of India, successive governments, have attempted repeated engagements with Pakistan. When my party was in power from the period 1998 to 2004, Prime Minister Vajpayee took the first initiative when he went in a bus driving to Lahore and took a very large part of India's political community as also the Indian intelligentsia along with him so that we could improve upon the action. While the Indian Prime Minister had taken this initiative and we were in Lahore, we found the infiltration in Kargil had started, and the civilian government in Pakistan was claiming that they were not aware of what was happening. It was more at the behest of the army they maintained at that time. Despite that, a few years later, again Prime Minister Vajpayee took the initiative by inviting President Musharraf to Agra for a summit dialogue so that we could initiate some kind of a dialogue in the whole process. Things didn't work. Finally, it was in 2004 January that we decided that there was a joint communication which was then issued, And that's broadly been my party's position and the government of India's position for a very long time, though there have been marginal variations from time to time, that Pakistan commit itself that its territory won't be used for terror against India. And upon that assurance, a composite dialogue between the two nations does take place. We've made these efforts repeatedly, but then at times they get altered and they get halted because of various actions which take place from across the border. The attack on Indian Parliament was one such instance. The Mumbai attack on 26/11 was one such instance. And they create a national mood of anger in India where this entire process of a dialogue itself starts suffering. The way Pakistan has evolved, and that's an important consideration in India's foreign policy priorities, it can simultaneously be an ally of the United States on the war against terror. It can also be a friend of those who are responsible for the terror. Therefore, in Afghanistan, its own role of its agencies in promoting the Afghan Taliban, similarly its role of its official agencies in promoting the Lashkar-e-Taiba, now renamed the JUD as far as India is concerned, and a large number of instances of attacks in India have been directly attributed to these bodies. The distinction between state actors and non-state actors in this partly gets obliterated. Then, of course, there is a third force which may not be entirely a state actor, which is the Taliban within Pakistan, who now poses one of the biggest threats because they've been attacking their military establishments. A part of their own army gets radicalized. Their intelligence agencies have got radicalized. And therefore, they've been claiming that their ultimate object is to take over the state and also take position as far as strategic assets are concerned. So we on a foreign policy priority, therefore, have always been very concerned as to what we do under the circumstances. Particularly after the events at Abbottabad which took place,